stationed out here in Colorado Springs. We know that he stayed up at the Broadmoor Hotel. And we know that he visited what is now the fluorescent fossils over not too far outside of Colorado Springs. We know all this because he bought one of the fossils, and that fossilized tree is now standing guard in Disneyland. Walt bought it, took it back to Disneyland, ostensibly as a gift for his wife. But yeah, so at some point while he was here, he visited Earl Partridge. You see them there with the Air Defense Command flag, the emblem on the front of that, and more on that in a minute. But anytime I can combine my passion for Air Force history and my passion for all things Disney is a good day. So let's talk about how I'm actually going to approach the presentation today. I'll try to talk for 30 or 40 minutes here and then turn it over to questions at the end. Hopefully we'll have a good Q&A there. But along the way, if you want to raise your hand, virtually, if you will, please feel free to do so. And I know some folks are monitoring that. I really have no problem with being interrupted throughout the presentation if I'm not making something abundantly clear. So here's how we are going to get to the mountain itself. All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about the post-World War II era, the rise of the Cold War, the need for North American defense, which will lead us into the creation of NORAD. We'll talk a little while about Int Air Force Base. I'm going to point out some buildings to you that are still in the downtown area. We'll talk about the various command centers, because really when you talk about NORAD, it's all about the command centers. We'll talk about some problems with Int Air Force Base, why it was not an ideal candidate to be a command center, and that will get us into the actual building of the Cheyenne Mountain Center. And then we'll close it up with the Chidlaw Building, which is more or less just kind of an interesting piece of trivia for you. All right, so let's talk about NORAD and what NORAD is. Oftentimes, when I give a presentation like this, the perception is that NORAD is the mountain itself, right? That NORAD and the mountain are kind of synonymous with each other. And if you were familiar with the early 1980s movie War Games, starring Matthew Broderick and Ali Sheedy, it's kind of used interchangeably there. So you think that NORAD is the mountain itself, but it's not, right? So what is NORAD? Well, initially it stood for the North American Air Defense Command. All right. And so when you say North America, in this particular case, you mean both the United States and Canada. What is an exceptionally long story short is that after World War II, with the rise of the Soviet Union, with the rise of long-range Soviet bombers, with the specter of World War III always on the horizon, the United States military, the United States government, and the government of Canada, the military of Canada, started working together in the late 1940s to try to figure out a way to defend both countries from the perceived Soviet threat, right? This all comes together by the mid to late 1950s. Agreements are made, papers are signed, hands are shaken, and Canada and the United States decide to form a bi-national command, the North American Air Defense Command. So the question becomes, well, where do you put it? All right. If you're going to watch out for all of those various Soviet bombers that could come over the poles, you're going to need a headquarters building, and you're going to headquarters it at the now defunct Int Air Force Base, and you're going to put it inside this building. So this is a 1920s, 1930s postcard, and you'll notice on the bottom that it says the National Methodist Sanatorium. There were a number of these along the Front Range, primarily to treat tuberculosis. If you remember from your Old West history, Doc Holliday stayed in one up in Glenwood Springs before he passed away. but there were really dozens of these tuberculosis sanatoriums all along the Front Range, and the National Methodist one was right here in Colorado Springs. Int Air Force Base more or less grew up around it. Now the building itself is no longer standing, but more on what's there here in a little bit. All right, so you have a NORAD, you have a headquarters building. Now you need all of the pieces to make that work together. So you can see the NORAD headquarters in the background there. You can see the Int Air Force Base there. You can see something of a combined color guard with American and Canadians. And then I want you to kind of look at the different headquarters that are stationed in this building. And this is where it can get really confusing. Because note that you have North American Air Defense Command, or NORAD. You have U.S. Army Air Defense Command, or AARDCOM. You have Naval Forces NORAD, and you have Air Defense Command. So you'll note that Air Defense Command is printed there, 3 different headquarters, 3 different organizations. Air Defense Command is a U.S. Air Force organization. Naval Forces NORAD is obviously a Navy organization. U.S. Army Air Defense Command, obviously the Army Air Defense, and then the NORAD headquarters itself. So you've got NORAD, which is the overarching umbrella. And then under that, you've got Army components, Navy components, Air Force components, and then Canadian Forces components as well. And I know that can be extraordinarily kind of difficult to follow, but you've got all of these various pieces, and everyone plays into the NORAD operations, right? So you've got Navy picket ships off the coast. You've got air defense fighter aircraft. You've got air defense radars. You've got Canadian radar systems. You have Army surface-to-air missile systems to protect major cities, and all of that is what NORAD is all about, right? So what's the principal mission of NORAD? Well, it really hasn't changed since NORAD stood up in 1957. The 3 primary missions today, we would say, are aerospace warning, aerospace control, and maritime warning. Really, when you're talking about the Cold War NORAD, we are looking up and out and defending America and Canada from possible Soviet bombers coming over the poles or coming in from Alaska and the like. All right. So it is the air defense mechanism for the United States. Were the Soviets to come over, NORAD would detect those things. NORAD would then tell the Strategic Air Command to launch their bombers. And so NORAD is something of a tripwire for the air defense of the United States. All right, pardon me. Hopefully that all makes sense. So look, you have a NORAD, the binational command. You have a headquarters building. And then what is the next logical thing that you need? Well, you need an operations center, right? You need somewhere that you can monitor, that you can tie in all of these radar stations, all of these airfields, all of these picket ships. All of that information needs to be centralized somewhere. I recently did a review on a book that talked about all of these different operations centers. And so they talk about the NORAD Operations Center. They talk about mission control for NASA. They talk about the Strategic Air Command Operations Center. And these are kind of the first models for like a worldwide command and control center, right? So where does NORAD put their very first operations center? Well, you're just going to have to tack it on to the headquarters building. There's really nowhere else to put it. So you remember the picture of the sanatorium there, the NORAD headquarters. Right next to that, you are going to build the NORAD Operations Center. And so this is really everything that you would ever see in a movie, right? I don't know if you can see my cursor, but we've got the very Dr. Strangelove big board. We've got the wall clocks telling you what time it is everywhere. You've got all of your officers and enlisted forces who are monitoring everything. And then in the top right picture, if you could look up into the back right there, you've got that glassed in enclosure where the very important generals would sit. All right, so that's your NORAD Operations Center. All right. So now let's orient to a little bit of urban archaeology, if you will, right? Let's look at what was going on in downtown Colorado Springs, okay? So this is Ent Air Force Base. For those of you that drive downtown often, these road names and some of these sites are going to be very familiar to you. So here's Boulder right here. Here is the NORAD Command Center, or here's the NORAD headquarters. And then the Operations Center that I just showed you is attached on the side of that. Can someone give me can everyone see my cursor when I do that?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I'm not talking into nothing there. So, all right, so you got the headquarters building, you got the Operations Center. But what I want you to notice about this is downtown Colorado Springs, right? Like, it's not like Peterson Air Force Base today is kind of out a little bit, right? Kind of out away from the city, a fenced in area, but Ent itself is very, very urban. The reason I've got the red arrow on this smokestack here is so when I go to the next photograph, the red arrow continues to point over at that smokestack. And you'll have to forgive me. I'm going to flip back and forth between these two pictures here to orient you. So here's the headquarters building. Here is the smokestack. Here is the smokestack. And then the headquarters building is in the lower right here in this group of trees. So now to orient you to where everything is, here's Boulder, here's Union, here's Dale Street. But today, if you were to drive down to the corner of Boulder and Union, this would not be here anymore, right? Right here at the corner, this is now the U.S. Olympic Training Center. So if you go down there and they've got the very large globe and they've got the Olympic emblems down there, all of that sits right here at the corner of Boulder and Union, okay? These three buildings here that I have in the little red square, those are now dormitories for the Olympic athletes. Those buildings are still there today. So when Ent Air Force Base closes down, and that's in 1976 or thereabouts, when Ent Air Force Base closes down, the city of Colorado Springs takes over Ent, and then it will eventually go to become the site of the U.S. Olympic Training Center. All right. So again, what you would need to notice about this is that it is a very, very urban area. All of these houses obviously are still standing down there as well, but it's a very urban area. There's really no way to stop anyone from driving these streets. So even as NORAD stands up in 1957 and 1958, there's a real fear that it's not ideally located. The fear within the United States military is not only about the possibility of, large scale Soviet bombers coming over, but there's a real fear for sabotage from within the United States. So there is a fear that the Soviets could easily attack the NORAD headquarters building. And then what do you do, right? If they could somehow plant some type of device next to the Operations Center, the United States would effectively be blind. So even as NORAD stands up in 1957, senior officers are already looking for a way to harden the facility. Strategic Air Command's headquarters is in Omaha, Nebraska. They go underground. They build a multi-level underground facility, but again, kind of out away from any cities. We don't really have that option at Ent. So even as NORAD stands up, senior officers begin to look around, not really only the city, but the country, to find a place where you could put a command center that could be less vulnerable to sabotage or to attack. So Strategic Air Command goes underground. Where does NORAD go? Well, we go into the mountain, all right? So we begin construction on the Cheyenne Mountain complex. NORAD stands up in 1957. We do not move into the Cheyenne Mountain facility until 1967, a decade later. This picture here on your left, this is the initial blast. This is your groundbreaking ceremony, if you will. This occurs in May of 1961. And again, it's going to be another 6 years until the complex itself is ready to be occupied as a command center. So what happens, in those 6 years? Why does it take so long? Well, there's actually a couple of reasons. Obviously, no project is going to go on time, but there's several reasons that it takes so long to actually get the center open. One, it only takes about a year to excavate the mountain, all right, to dig everything out. The Utah Construction Company does this. In my NORAD office, I've actually still got all of the plans and the files from the construction of the site, but it only takes about a year to dig the site out. Well, after the site is dug out, the NORAD commander, general by the name of Lawrence Cuter, goes into the hollowed out command or into the hollowed out mountain and says, nope, we need a bigger hole. All right. So he basically tells the mining company to go back in there and make it larger. In the process of hollowing out the mountain, another problem occurs. What they find is that there is a fault line running right down the middle of where they want to begin to put the buildings, all right? And the fear is that if there's ever a blast or even an earthquake, that fault line in the mountain could fracture and collapse. So one of the reasons it takes so long to complete construction inside the mountain is once they discover the fault line, they have to find a way to, one, fool the mountain into thinking the fault line's not there. And so they have to block it. And so what you see in the upper right-hand corner is a very, very large concrete dome. And so this has to be constructed in addition to all of the excavation that's being done, and it has to be put into place before the actual buildings themselves can be installed. And so this takes some time. What you're looking at there on the left is you can see kind of the hollow out area there, and that's where they're going to eventually jack this large concrete dome up. What's interesting about this dome is it's visible today. It actually sits directly above the command center that's inside the mountain. If you walk right outside the command center and you look up, they've left part of that kind of glassed off, and you can look up and see that concrete dome. So it's sitting there today. So look, it takes 2 or 3 years to excavate the site. It takes a further 3 years to get it all set up, and that is in addition to building the buildings. Now, I don't know if any of the listeners today have ever been inside, but let me tell you a little bit about what is actually inside Cheyenne Mountain Air Force Station. It is 2,000 feet under the top of Cheyenne Mountain. It takes up about 5 acres of land in total. There are 15 3-story buildings. Every one of those buildings is connected to each other. And every one of those buildings sits on a system of giant springs. So if you look in the bottom right photo, which is actually the entrance to the first building, if you were to be able to see under here, you would see these ginormous springs that all of the buildings sit on. There's about 1,000 of those springs. When I would give tours up in the mountain, I would jokingly ask, what do we call those springs? Of course, no one would know. And I would say, well, obviously we call them Colorado Springs.
Ouch.
Oh, it's very much a dad joke, and one I very much enjoyed giving. The springs are there to keep the buildings themselves level in the event of in the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s, in the event of a Soviet atomic or nuclear attack, they would allow the buildings to have a little give if the mountain itself were to shake. So, what's inside these 15 different buildings? Well, there's an awful lot, right? There's obviously the command center itself. There's a medical facility, there's storage facilities, there's sleeping areas and cots for most of the personnel. There is a cafeteria, there is a fitness center. There are rooms for some of the more senior level general officers who would be in there in the case of an event, or more likely when we have operational exercises run out of there. Now, excuse me, now that's a lot of stuff, right? A store, a cafeteria, a fitness center, a command center. Do not think that this looks like what you see in the movies. These are not very, very large buildings. They are constructed using the same steel that you would use for a Navy ship. So once you are inside Cheyenne Mountain, it is more like being inside a submarine than it is being inside a very large command center. It is a small area. It is pretty easy to get claustrophobic in there. And of course, I would be remiss if I did not talk about what everyone is familiar with from the mountain, and that is the two 25-ton blast doors. The picture on your lower right is actually taken right at the exit to the second blast door. So there are a series of two doors. They can actually be hand cranked closed, despite the fact that they are 25 tons, and they can seal off everything inside. All 15 buildings, it's on its own power source. They have their own generators. They have their own water treatment facilities in there. They have their own water in there. So it's actually quite an impressive facility. But yeah, the 25-ton blast doors designed to be closed. And then in the event of an actual blast, the blast power itself would seal the doors shut. All right. It would force them closed. All right. So let me go ahead here and talk a little bit about the Chidlaw Building, because this one kind of gets left out in the dark sometimes. So, you may be confused if you see the picture here and you go headquarters, Air Defense Command, and it's also later going to be headquarters to North American Air Defense Command. And you might wonder, how many headquarters does NORAD or Air Defense Command or any organization need, right? Like, you've got the headquarters building on Ent Air Force Base. You got an operations center that you're building in a mountain. And the long story short is that as NORAD basically gets bigger, right? Anytime an organization matures, you're going to get more people, you're going to need more space. And so basically we outrun the capacity that is the old sanatorium building, right? So we need a new headquarters. The problem is that the command center in the mountain is not finished yet, right? 1961 to 1967. So in 1963, we build the Chidlaw Building, right? It's not actually on Ent Air Force Base. It's a couple blocks away. It's an easy walk, but you put the headquarters and you put the operations center into the Chidlaw Building, basically until the Cheyenne Mountain Operations Center is finished, right? So the NORAD headquarters, the Air Defense Command headquarters, and the command center itself is going to be operated out of the Chidlaw Building until 1967, when we can move the command center up inside the mountain, which was its initial purpose, right? So what's interesting about the Chidlaw Building today is, hey, it's still downtown. You could get up, leave this presentation when we're all finished here, and you could drive downtown and see it. And so if you look at this map here, here's a downtown map. So here's Union, here's Boulder, here is the U.S. Olympic Training Center. In the top here are those three buildings. Two of those three buildings I showed you earlier that are the Olympic dormitories now. The sanatorium building itself used to sit roughly right here where it says U.S. Olympic Training Center. There is a building that's right here that's kind of behind the red arrow that's original to Int Air Force Base. It still stands. And then here is the Chidlaw Building, which sits off of Bijou. The Chidlaw Building has gone through various occupants over the last 4 or 5 decades, actually. And it's just kind of a space for that various companies could rent today. But at 221 East Bijou Street, you could go down and see the former headquarters of the North American Air Defense Command today. And then if you drive around this area, with my trained eye, having been on, who knows how many Air Force bases, I can look around and still see buildings that I'm fairly certain were indigenous to Int Air Force Base. And this here, it says computer building. That's where we stuck a lot of the high capacity computers, which probably, needed a building back then. And it's probably all in my iPhone today. But again, this kind of gives you an idea of what downtown would have looked like in the 1960s and what it looks like today, and those buildings still being there. Now, I had thought that I would turn it over to questions, but I've only gone for about 30 minutes here, so I'm going to take up another 10 minutes of your time before turning it over to questions. And I want to talk about probably the most famous aspect of NORAD. I mentioned the movie War Games, 1983 movie that deals with NORAD itself. But that is probably one of 2 things that NORAD is for. And of course, the other thing is NORAD Track Santa, our annual event where you can call in and get a track on Santa's current location. And so let me talk just for a minute about how that comes to be. And if any of you are familiar with the movie The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, I don't want to butcher the quote, but when truth becomes the legend, print the legend. There's lots of stories about how NORAD Track Santa starts. We know that it does begin with an erroneous phone call in 1955. We know that phone call does reach one of the Operations Center leaders, a Colonel Schaup. And we do know that Colonel Schaup uses that incident as a way to kind of public outreach what at the time Air Defense Command, because NORAD doesn't come along for another 2 or 3 years, for a time what Air Defense Command and later what NORAD does. Long story short, a young man misdials a number, thinking he is going to talk to Santa Claus. Instead, he gets Colonel Schaup in the Air Defense Command headquarters building. Colonel Schaup then puts out a memo that says, hey, don't worry about it, kids. For anyone that might have heard, we are tracking him and we are protecting him from anyone who does not believe in Christmas. Well, that happens in 1955. In 1956, Public Affairs decides, hey, let's put out another message. And it just kind of goes from there. And so this becomes a 60-year mission now where NORAD continues every December 24th to track Santa. And that is about it. So I've gone, I guess, 35 minutes here. I will now turn it over to questions, and I am happy to talk about any aspect of NORAD history that should suit anyone's fancy.
Okay, so if the audience, if you want to just do a group chat, and then I'll read the questions one at a time. So if you go into your chat feature and direct your questions to Dr. Laslie, I'll read them out loud for you. Alternatively, you could raise your hand and I'll scroll and see if your hand's raised.
There's got to be a few questions out there.
Here, I have a question for you because my background is emergency management, business continuity. How often do they hand crank test those doors?
So my understanding is that the doors have only been closed in a real world scenario one time, and that was on 9/11. but they are tested. You know, I don't know how many times they are tested throughout the year, but anytime we have a major exercise, and maybe this is something that I should have mentioned, the NORAD and now U.S. Northern Command Center, what we lovingly call the N2C2 NORAD NORTHCOM Command Center, is at Peterson Air Force Base. Now we still use the mountain. There are things that we can only do inside the mountain, but we still exercise up there. It is an alternate command center. And anytime we have an exercise, we will simulate closing those doors. So numerous times a year, they get tested out. Okay.
And Rachel is asking if the mountain is open to tours.
No, unfortunately, it's not. This is kind of a back and forth. I will not say it will never be open to tours, but this is kind of a thing that kind of comes and goes. So oddly enough, look, I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, and this may sound weird, but I came out here on a field trip when I was in high school, and we went inside the mountain on a tour. I used to give tours, relatively frequently, 5 or 6 years ago, but it's not currently something that's being done, but hold out hope. I wouldn't be surprised if maybe in a couple of years, we could get folks back up inside the building. Cause it is really a neat place to see, to walk down that quarter mile roadway going into the mountain before you see the blast doors themselves.
Yeah, that seems like that would be super cool. Doug is asking, how long is the mountain self-sufficient?
I want to say, and I can't remember off the top of my head, I want to say it's like 30 days. I think when we do exercises, I think we're told to, pack everything that we would need for 30 days is kind of the going rate, if you will. But again, as a standalone facility, I think really the limiting factor would be things like food storage and the like, but I want to say it's 30 days.
That's interesting. I would have thought it was longer.
Hey, I am adult enough to admit I could be wrong.
Fair enough. Does anybody else have any questions? Okay, so Ron Sharp Jr. is asking, what are some of the major differences between the real complex and how it's presented in war games?
All right, so war games, I once read, war games is like what the command center would like to think of itself as. So it's like the command center on steroids, right? So if you look at the movie War Games, they've got these huge, 2-story boards. They've got stairs that go down to the floor. They got this series of pits, almost like in Apollo 13, where it kind of goes down to the center there, and then you got the big boards. The actual command center inside the mountain is probably not much larger than the basement that I am sitting in right now. If you were to go into that alternate command center, what would surprise you is how small it is. Again, there's just not that much room inside the mountain. Now they can do everything they need to do in there. They've got big screens. They're not multi-story big screens. They've got every seat that needs to be filled. There's still a place. There's still that glassed-in area for the important senior generals to overlook everything. But it is much smaller than you would actually think in reality. So if you were to like Google, NORAD war games right now, you get this huge room, and it does not look like that at all.
Andres asked. Oh, go ahead.
No, what I would say is, when you think about what's inside the mountain, think of it much more as what a Navy ship would look like, than what you might think like a movie. And of course, in a movie, you got to make it look good, right? The command center's got to look good. So think it's reminds me much more of like a Navy ship than a really big command center.
Okay, and Ron says, thank you for that answer. Andre would like to know if there's a drinking water reservoir in there, and if so, what's the source of the water?
Yeah, so in the blasting out of and thank you for that question, because I was trying to talk about this earlier, and I could not get to the word reservoir. So they discovered in blasting out the facility a self-contained internal source of water in the building, and that became there are, I believe, 3 very large, look big enough to put a couple of rowboats out on, reservoirs inside the building. And so that's for the heating and cooling, the utilities, and that is part of the industrial complex. Look, as a professional historian, I don't often tell my students, well, the best source for this is Wikipedia. But I think there is a map on the Wikipedia that'll show you kind of the internal layout, and it'll show you the reservoirs in there. But yeah, there's 3 very large reservoirs in there.
Hey, that's interesting. Josh is asking, does it look like anything like the Stargate series, or was that completely fabricated for the series?
Well, obviously,
or anything like that.
Obviously, we've got the Stargate in there, and that's a highly classified piece of material. No, okay, I will confess to having never seen Stargate, but I have probably been asked this question more than any other question. No, it doesn't really look like that. If I remember correctly, there is a scene in, I believe the movie is Man of Steel, the recent Man of Steel movie, 4 or 5 years now, that they have an internal NORAD command center. And that's really what it looks like. I mean, it looks like a bunch of, it doesn't look like anything different than any other office building. A couple of big screens, a bunch of computers sitting next to each other. It's not cubicles, but it's not far off. But yeah, so I guess I'm going to have to add Stargate to my repertoire of war games and other pop culture events that feature NORAD. I guess we could call it Independence Day too, because we get a shout out on Independence Day.
Andre's asking, what sort of ongoing maintenance do they do at the mountain?
So here's this. That's a really good question. And this is something that has been really confused over the last decade or so, 15 years or so. So, again, I mentioned that NORAD becomes synonymous with the mountain, and I've kind of talked about it that way just because it's the easiest way to do it. So the mountain itself is the Cheyenne Mountain Air Force Station, right? So it's not an Air Force base, it's not big enough, but it is an Air Force station. Other organizations other than just NORAD and Northern Command use that facility on a daily basis. So there's always someone inside the mountain. There are people that work up there on the daily. It was used extensively over the last year of our COVID response operations as a way to continue to do the NORAD and NORTHCOM mission and keep our crews socially distant. So we used it a lot over the last year, actually. But there's always someone in the mountain. And the confusion comes from several years ago when we put the NORAD and NORTHCOM Command Center at Peterson Air Force Base. The thought was, and I was as guilty of this as anyone else before I got here, the thought was that, the mountain was now closed, that no one was up there, that it was in some type of cold storage. And I used to go around saying, that's going to become the United States Cold War Museum because we don't use it. But that's totally not true. There are always people up there. There are always organizations other than, NORAD and NORTHCOM. There's other military organizations that work out of there on the daily basis. The alternate command center, we can stand that up fairly quickly. So there's always someone in there. So it is an active Air Force station with active missions going on the daily.
Josh would like to know, how many levels are there to the base?
So there are 15 buildings inside the hollowed out mountain. Those buildings are anywhere between 2 and 3 stories. And that composes all of your different, rec rooms, cafeteria, sleeping area, storage area, medical facility, command center, and then whatever other offices need to be occupied up there. So that the buildings themselves are 2 to 3 stories, and it's very, I keep going back to the Navy ship analogy, but that's what it looks like, right? Like the metal staircases, the metal walls, storage along the walls. So yeah, but I think that should answer your question. They're all about 3 stories each.
So Brian, is it a aircraft carrier type or a destroyer type or submarine type? I mean, I've been on all of them, and I think about the Ronald Reagan. That's pretty spacious.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely not that spacious. It's not claustrophobic like you would be on a submarine. It's not that small. The stairways themselves are kind of normal size stairways. You could get a good group going up and down those. But it's very Spartan, I'll say that.
I think that's interesting. Okay, Andre's asking, is there access from the top of Cheyenne Mountain to the inside? And is it true that the top of the mountain has security cameras and is patrolled and off limits?
Well, the Air Force Station itself, I will say, is patrolled and off limits, and that would give anything that would include anything that's within the wire perimeter of the fence. Look, what's interesting is a lot of what is on top of Cheyenne Mountain are cell towers and TV relay station towers and other engineering and electronic towers that I'm probably not familiar with. And they're up there just because that's the best place to put a tower, right? That's where you're going to get the most direct line of sight for UHF or whatever it is that, those guys use. The mountain itself, again, here's your Wikipedia map answer. The mountain itself is kind of in a U shape, if you will. So if you go in one side, and let me share the screen and go back to a picture here. Yeah, so if this is the Cheyenne Mountain entrance, if you go down this tunnel about a quarter mile, if you go down that tunnel about a quarter mile and turn to your right, that's where the blast doors are. And then that's where all of the facilities are. But this road itself continues to go around. And it comes out kind of on the other side of the mountain. There's a road. It's a continuous loop road. But that was a design feature so that if there was a blast outside of the mountain, the force of that blast would travel down this tunnel, basically in one side and out the other. So look, I am not an engineering expert. To my knowledge, you would not want to go from the bottom of the facility to the top of the mountain. That would not be the easiest way to get out. So I don't think there is a way to go to the top of the mountain from inside. In fact, I'm almost positive there is not. But just to give you an idea, it's more or less a U-shaped tunnel with the mountain dug out to put the buildings in, and I hope that answered the question.
Thank you. Oh, there we go. Does anybody else have a question? This has been interesting to hear these questions have been asked.
This is one of the reasons I always like getting to the Q&A, because the Q&A always covers the areas I either forget to talk about or what people are really interested in hearing about.
Right. Well, I don't see any more questions. I think that's it for questions for you.
All right, well, great. Well, I'm happy to hang out for a few minutes if anyone wants to hang on. And thank you so very much for having me. I have to say that it's a real pleasure to be able to do these Zoom meetings, and I look forward to getting back and seeing folks in person too.
So people are saying thank you. It was an awesome presentation. And now Josh is asking, can you see the base from anywhere that's not, hold on.
Yeah, actually, the best way, and I know where to look, but the best way to pick out Cheyenne Mountain Air Force Station is at night. If you're coming down 25 and you're relatively near Cheyenne Mountain, at night you can see, if you come from the top of the mountain down, you'll see what looks like two kind of levels of lights. One of those is a parking area. Well, they're both parking areas. And then the upper one is kind of where the actual entrance to the Cheyenne Mountain facility is. So yeah, you can't see the tunnel, you can't see the doors, but you can see the actual part of the base lit up at night. Pretty easy to pick out on the side of the mountain.
That's interesting. I'll have to look for that. More people saying thank you. I think everybody's really enjoyed your presentation today.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. I'm always happy to talk about this. So yeah, jump in your cars, head downtown. 221 East Bijou Street is the Chidlaw Building. You can drive by that this afternoon, and then the U.S. Olympic Training Center is where the old Air Force Base and the sanatorium and the old NORAD headquarters building used to be. But a lot of those buildings were repurposed. So some of those you can still see today.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm going to have to go down and look. I was just driving around that area not too long ago, and I'll have to go back and look around.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, the U.S. Olympic Training Center, the 3 dormitories are original. The Olympic Training Center itself, kind of the visitor center there, is right where the sanatorium used to be. And if you're in that parking lot and you look to your left, you can see what they have a conference center that was the part of the old Air Force Base Conference Center as well. So,
yeah, really fascinating talk today. We appreciate you spending time with us. We love having interesting conversations. This is just awesome.
I sincerely appreciate it. Thanks for everyone's time.
Okay, thanks everybody.
And as they sign off, I'll hang out for just a minute in case there's anything else.
Okay.
Hopefully that is what you guys were looking for.
Yeah, I think I really think it's interesting. And yeah, obviously you got good feedback. Everybody's saying they enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's neat to be able to go and see some of these places. And it's funny that if you drove by the Chidlaw Building, you would not think anything of it, right? Like it would not be that interesting a building. I think TV companies have rented out of it and the like, but there's not much there to see. But it's amazing to stand in front of that and go, this used to be the headquarters of all aerospace defense for the United States.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Josh would like to know if there's any helipads or airstrip to access the base.
No airstrips up there. One of the big reasons that the command center itself was moved into Peterson Air Force Base is 15 years ago, the commander of NORAD took the Secretary of Defense on a drive to show him how long it takes to get from Peterson up to the mountain. And that's about 30 minutes on a good day. And so that was one of the reasons it led to the creation of a new command center. So no airstrip up there. I'm certain that there are areas you could land a helicopter, but I'm not sure off the top of my head if there's like an official area. But the way we get up there, the way the general gets up there is just like everyone else. We drive.
Interesting. Okay. Wasn't able to sign until late. Will there be another broadcast of this talk? Yes, if you weren't able to join, this is going to be later on this afternoon or tomorrow. We'll have the recording of this broadcast up on the Manitou Springs Heritage Center website. We have a YouTube channel for those presentations, so you'll be able to find it there.
Good. I want to be able to put this out for all my friends and family to see as well.
Excellent. Excellent. And Brandon from Fox 21 did ask his permission to record.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I gave him that at the start.
Hopefully he got something worthwhile.
Yeah, it'd be fun if you get to be on the news tonight.
Yeah, who knows?
Okay. Shall we wrap it up? I'm going to go out and prep for hail.
Okay. Well, yeah. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I will go ahead and sign off now, and you know how to get in touch with me if you need anything else. Happy to do this, and maybe in the future, once I'm up at the Air Force Academy, we can do one of these again.
Oh, that'd be awesome. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. I'm going to stop recording now.
Okay.
Yes.